For years, my name slowly disappeared from my own family's history. Not through arguments, not through scandal, but through silence. Photos were replaced, stories were retold without me. Holidays passed as if I had never existed. I told myself it was distance misunderstanding time. I learned how to live without asking questions because asking hurt more than being ignored. Then one afternoon, a plain legal envelope arrived in my mailbox. No apology, no emotion, just facts, dates, signatures, and a truth so carefully buried that it explained every missing photo, every locked door, every forced smile that never reached their eyes. What I learned wasn't just about money or paperwork. It was about how easily someone can be erased when others decide their existence is inconvenient. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when silence finally meets the law, and the past is forced to speak in public. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I read more than you think. And if stories about quiet endurance and late justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. Sometimes the truth arrives slowly, but it always arrives. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of place where every driveway had a basketball hoop and every family looked complete from the sidewalk. My parents liked to say we were close-knit. They said it often, especially when other people were around. And for a long time, I believed it because I didn't know what being truly included was supposed to feel like. There were 3 of us kids. My older sister Emily arrived first and carried that invisible title her entire life, the standard. She was brilliant without trying, confident in a way teachers adored. My parents spoke about her achievements, like investments paying interest. Everything she did felt intentional, celebrated, recorded. My younger brother Ryan came later, the miracle baby, the one my parents swore they weren't planning for. He grew up surrounded by patience and laughter, protected from disappointment whenever possible. Mistakes were lessons for him. Setbacks were temporary. And then there was me. I was never openly criticized. No one yelled at me or told me I wasn't good enough. That's what made it confusing. Instead, I existed in a softer shadow. I was the child my parents never worried about and never noticed because of it. At dinner, conversation flowed around me. If I spoke, it was acknowledged politely, then moved past. When report cards came home, my parents glanced at mine before setting it aside to study Emily's. When relatives visited, they hugged me with the same warmth as everyone else, but their questions stopped early. How's school? Good. That's nice. That was usually where it ended. I learned without being taught how to shrink myself. I learned that being easy made life smoother. I stopped asking for help, stopped announcing my successes, stopped expecting anything beyond the basics. I thought this was maturity. I thought this was independence. It wasn't until I was a teenager that something inside me started to feel off. Family photos lined the hallway, wall, vacations, birthdays, graduations. One afternoon I stopped in front of them and realized I couldn't find myself in most of them. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe I was behind the camera. Maybe I had missed that trip. Memory plays tricks when you don't want to accuse the people who raised you. When I was 17, I received an academic award at school. Nothing extraordinary, but something I was proud of. I brought the certificate home, laid it carefully on the kitchen counter. My mom smiled. "That's great, honey." Then she folded it and slid it into a drawer. Not the keepsake drawer, not the framed wall drawer, just a drawer. A week later, Emily's internship acceptance letter went up on the fridge. Framed. I didn't feel anger then. I felt something quieter and heavier, like I had misunderstood the rules of belonging. College gave me distance. Physical distance first, emotional distance later. I attended a state university a few hours away. I paid for most of it myself with scholarships and part-time work. My parents came to move me in, helped carry boxes, hugged me goodbye. "Call when you can," my mom said. I did. At first. The calls became shorter over time, then less frequent. When I visited home, I noticed changes. The house felt rearranged, not just physically, but emotionally. Conversations didn't pause when I entered the room. Decisions had already been made without me. One Thanksgiving, I noticed an old photo missing from the living room shelf. It was from when I was about 9 years old, me, Emily, and Ryan sitting on the porch steps, all of us grinning with missing teeth. "Where's the porch photo?" I asked, lightly. My dad didn't look up from the TV. "Which one?" "The one with all 3 of us." Another pause. A familiar one. "Oh," my mom said. "I think I packed it away. It didn't match the others." I nodded. I always nodded. Over the years, that pattern repeated. I disappeared from stories told at family gatherings. My name was skipped when childhood memories were shared. Events I clearly remembered being part of were retold as if I had never been there. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was remembering incorrectly. Maybe I had always been more on the edges than I realized. When Emily got married, I received the invitation late. My seat at the reception was far from the family table. During speeches, my parents spoke proudly about their two incredible children. No one corrected them. I smiled through it. I always smiled. After the wedding, the photo album arrived. I flipped through it slowly, page by page, my hands steady until they weren't. I appeared once, barely. Cropped at the side of a group photo, my face half-shadowed like an accident the editor hadn't fully erased. That night alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor and stared at that page for a long time. It wasn't the absence that hurt the most. It was the intention behind it. Someone had chosen what to keep. Someone had decided what no longer belonged. By my late 20s, my parents stopped calling altogether. Holidays passed without invitations. News reached me through mutual acquaintances or social media posts I wasn't tagged in. I told myself this was adulthood. This was distance. This was normal. But deep down, I knew something else was happening. I just didn't have the words for it yet. I wasn't drifting away from my family. I was being quietly removed. By the time I turned 30, the absence had become structured. It wasn't chaotic or emotional. It was organized, methodical, almost professional. I didn't know how else to describe it then, but looking back, that's exactly what it was. My family hadn't simply forgotten me. They had edited me out. It started with the small things that no one ever thinks to document. Holiday cards arrived without return addresses, as if sent from a place I was no longer allowed to locate. Group texts existed that I wasn't part of. I found out later, years later, that my parents had changed phone plans and forgotten to add me back. When I asked why I hadn't been included, my mother's answers were always gentle, almost rehearsed. "Oh, I didn't think you'd be interested. I didn't want to bother you. You're always so busy." Busy became the excuse that explained everything and nothing. I stopped correcting her. Every explanation required energy, and every explanation ended the same way, with her nodding sympathetically, then continuing as if the conversation had never happened. What hurt wasn't the exclusion itself. It was how quietly everyone agreed to it. I remember one Christmas Eve vividly. I had taken time off work thinking I might surprise them. I hadn't been invited, but I told myself families didn't need invitations. I drove 6 hours through sleet and traffic, arriving just after sunset. The house was full of light. Cars filled the driveway. Laughter spilled through the windows. When I knocked, my dad opened the door and froze. For a split second, his face showed something raw, panic maybe. Then it vanished. "Oh," he said. "You're here." Not, "We're so glad to see you." Not, "Why didn't you tell us? Just you're here." Inside, conversations slowed. Heads turned. My sister stared at me like she was trying to place where she'd seen me before. Ryan offered a polite smile, the kind you give a distant cousin. No one hugged me. I stayed less than an hour. I made excuses. I said I had to drive back that night. As I walked out, I noticed something that stayed with me far longer than the cold air on my face. There was no coat for me on the rack. Everyone else's jackets were there. Familiar shapes, familiar colors. But there was no empty space, no hook waiting. I wasn't expected. After that night, I stopped trying. Not out of anger, out of clarity. You don't keep knocking on a door that only opens by accident. Months turned into years. My life moved forward in ways that didn't require my family's involvement. I built a routine. I worked, paid rent, made friends who knew nothing about my childhood and didn't ask. But even as I moved on, my family continued moving backward, rewriting. I saw it on social media first. A throwback Thursday post from my mom. Photos from our childhood. Emily at piano recitals. Ryan in Little League uniforms. Captions full of nostalgia. I wasn't in any of them. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Then I noticed something stranger. Photos I knew existed, photos I remembered standing in, were posted again but cropped, or edited, or replaced entirely. In one picture, from a beach vacation, I had been standing between Emily and my dad. In the version my mom shared, there was a gap, just sand and ocean where I should have been. That was the moment my doubt turned into something colder. Erasure doesn't happen all at once. It happens when no one objects. I wondered who knew. Did my grandparents notice? Did my aunts and uncles remember me at all, or had repetition reshaped their memories too? Stories retold enough times become truth even when they aren't. Once, I ran into an old family friend at a grocery store near my parents' house. She squinted at me, smiling politely. "You look so familiar," she said. I told her my name. Her smile faltered. "Oh, right. Of course." The pause said everything. She hadn't forgotten me on her own. She had been taught how. The worst part was that there was no moment I could point to and say, "That's when it happened." No argument, no betrayal, no explosive event that justified what followed, which meant I had no defense. How do you accuse people of erasing you when they insist nothing is wrong? I tried once. I called my mother late one night after a long shift, my voice already shaking before she answered. "Do you still have the photo albums?" I asked. "Some of them," she said cautiously. "Am I in them?" Silence. "Why are you asking that?" she replied. I pressed on. I told her about the missing photos, the cropped images, the stories told without me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just asked. She sighed. "You're being sensitive." That word landed harder than anything else she could have said. Sensitive meant imagined, exaggerated, inconvenient. "We didn't do anything on purpose," she added quickly. "Life just changes." Then she changed the subject. After that call, I sat in my apartment in the dark, phone still in my hand, and realized something painful but important. If this had been an accident, someone would have tried to fix it. No one did. I began to understand that I wasn't dealing with neglect. I was dealing with revision. Someone had decided that the version of the family that existed publicly and legally didn't include me. And for reasons I didn't yet understand, everyone else had agreed to maintain that version. I didn't know why. I didn't know how deep it went. I didn't even know what it meant yet. All I knew was this: you don't erase someone from memories unless you're preparing to erase them from something else too. After I accepted that I wasn't drifting away from my family but being deliberately excluded, I did what I had been trained to do my entire life. I stayed quiet. Silence had always been my role. Silence kept things smooth. Silence kept me from being accused of overreacting, of being dramatic, of imagining problems where none existed. And so, I leaned into it, convincing myself that distance was a form of dignity. I stopped calling altogether. Weeks passed. Then months. No one noticed. No one checked in. The absence I feared became proof of something far worse: my presence had never been required to begin with. At first, I told myself this was freedom. I focused on work, poured energy into routines that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I took overtime shifts. I saved money. I upgraded my apartment from a one-bedroom to something slightly bigger, something that felt like progress. When coworkers talked about family holidays, I smiled politely and redirected the conversation. When friends asked about my parents, I said we weren't close. That was easier than explaining a story that didn't make sense even to me. But silence has a way of echoing. At night, I replayed moments I had once dismissed as insignificant. The way my parents avoided eye contact when I asked certain questions. The way my sister stiffened whenever my name came up in public. The way conversations abruptly shifted whenever the past edged too close to me. It felt less like neglect now, and more like coordination. I wondered when it had started, not when I noticed, but when they decided. There must have been a first moment. A conversation I wasn't in. A decision made quietly, efficiently. A reason they all agreed was justified enough to erase a person rather than confront the truth. That thought unsettled me more than anger ever could. Because if there was a reason, then it wasn't random. I tried once to rebuild a bridge. I emailed my father, short, neutral, carefully worded. I told him I missed them. That I didn't understand why we'd grown so distant. That I wanted to talk. The reply came 2 days later. "Things are complicated right now. Best to let them be." That was it. No explanation. No timeline. No invitation to revisit the conversation later. Just a quiet dismissal dressed up as concern. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing my laptop. Something hardened in my chest, then not resentment, but resolve. If they wouldn't tell me what I'd done wrong, I would stop assuming I had done anything wrong at all. Still, the consequences of being erased reached further than emotions. They crept into the practical corners of life. When I applied for a mortgage pre-approval, the bank asked for family contact information as part of a routine verification process. I listed my parents. The loan officer called me back a week later. They were confused, she said carefully. They said they don't really know you. I laughed because the alternative was to sit there and explain something I couldn't prove. Another time, a background check for a new job flagged a discrepancy in my early residential history. Addresses that didn't align, records that suggested I had lived somewhere without being officially listed. I had. My parents' house. It was as if my name had been selectively removed from certain documents, subtle enough not to raise alarms but thorough enough to cause problems when consistency mattered. I started pulling my own records, school transcripts, old tax filings, medical documents from childhood. Most of it was intact, but not all of it. Some files listed emergency contacts that didn't include my parents. Some forms had been updated years after I turned 18 without my knowledge. That was when unease replaced doubt. These weren't emotional oversights. They were administrative. Someone had taken steps. Someone had filled out forms. Someone had made decisions that required intent. I considered confronting my sister. She was the most organized of us, the most comfortable with details and logistics. If anyone knew what was happening, it was her. But every time I drafted the message, I deleted it. Something told me that asking directly would only tighten the silence around me. And I had spent too many years knocking on doors that never opened. So I waited, not passively, patiently. I focused on what I could control. I gathered copies of my documents. I stored backups. I created a paper trail for myself, even if no one else acknowledged it. I didn't know why I was doing it then. It just felt necessary. Like preparing for a storm you can sense before the clouds arrive. Years passed like that. Quiet, orderly, lonely in a way that didn't announce itself. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. I came home from work to find a large envelope resting against my apartment door. No return address, official seal, thick paper, the kind of envelope that doesn't arrive by accident. My name was typed cleanly on the front, not handwritten, not familiar, precise. For a long moment I didn't pick it up. I stood there, keys still in my hand, heart pounding with a recognition I couldn't explain. Whatever was inside that envelope had survived the erasure. And if someone had gone through the trouble of finding me now after years of silence, it meant the version of the story my family had been maintaining was no longer holding. I hadn't been contacted because they missed me. I had been contacted because something had gone wrong. I didn't open the envelope right away. That wasn't fear, it was instinct. When something arrives after years of silence, you learn to respect its weight. You learn that whatever is inside has already changed things, you just haven't caught up to it yet. I set my keys down, took off my jacket, and placed the envelope on the kitchen table like it might move on its own. The paper was thick, formal. No logo I recognized. No return address. Just my full legal name typed with unsettling accuracy. No one had used my full name in years. I made coffee. I didn't drink. I sat. I stood. I paced. I told myself I was being dramatic, that it was probably a mistake, a wrong address, a scam. But scams don't use certified tracking stickers, and they don't feel this deliberate. When I finally opened it, there was no letterhead at the top. Just a name, a law firm, a city 2 states away, and a single sentence that drained the air from the room. This correspondence concerns a matter in which you are a named party. Named, not mentioned, not referenced, named. The letter explained calmly, clinically, that a legal review was underway involving a family trust established years ago. A trust that had recently been challenged due to material discrepancies in beneficiary records. My name appeared in early drafts. Then it disappeared. I read that paragraph 3 times before my hands started to shake. The letter didn't accuse. It didn't explain. It simply stated facts, dates, and document numbers. It requested confirmation of my identity and included copies of forms I had never seen before. Forms dated when I was in college. Forms listing my parents as legal guardians updating records on my behalf. Records that no longer included me. The room felt too small, too quiet. I sat there, staring at the paper, trying to reconcile it with everything I had been told or not told for years. The missing photos, the rewritten stories, the administrative inconsistencies. They weren't random. They were preparation. The letter asked me to call. I didn't. Not that night. Instead, I pulled out the box where I kept my own documents. Birth certificate, social security card, old school records, medical forms. I laid them all out across the table, comparing dates, names, signatures, and then I saw it. A pattern. Updates made after I turned 18. Changes that required authorization. My parents' signatures appeared again and again, sometimes together, sometimes separately, on forms that quietly redefined my relationship to them. Emergency contacts removed. Dependent status altered. Beneficiary fields left blank where my name should have been. They hadn't erased me emotionally first. They had erased me legally. The next morning I called the number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as a paralegal. Her voice was neutral, practiced. She confirmed my identity, asked a few questions, then transferred me to an attorney. He didn't waste time. "You were originally listed as a contingent beneficiary," he said, "alongside your siblings. Originally. But those designations were amended," he continued, "multiple times, without your knowledge." I asked the only question that mattered. "Is that legal?" There was a pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. "That depends on intent," he said. "And documentation." He explained that the trust had been created by my grandparents years earlier. It was meant to be distributed among grandchildren under specific conditions. Education benchmarks, age thresholds, clauses that couldn't be altered without justification. At some point my name had been removed, not crossed out, not disputed, replaced. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not anger, not grief, but recognition. This was bigger than family tension, bigger than favoritism. This was about control. The attorney told me the trust had recently come under scrutiny because another party had contested a distribution. In the process, earlier drafts were pulled, discrepancies surfaced, and once someone noticed my name in the originals, questions followed. Why wasn't this beneficiary notified? Why was this amendment approved? Where is this individual now? That last question landed differently. Where was I now? For years my family had acted as if I didn't exist. Now legally they were being asked to explain why. I didn't confront anyone immediately. Not my parents, not my sister, not my brother. I needed to understand the full scope before I said a word. So I listened. Over the next few weeks I learned more than I ever wanted to know. About trusts, about guardianship authority, about how easily paperwork can be altered when no one expects resistance. I learned that my parents had cited estrangement as justification, that they claimed I had chosen to sever ties, that attempts to contact me had failed, none of which was true, but none of which had ever been challenged. Until now. The attorney asked if I wanted to formally contest the amendments. I asked what that would mean. "It would mean disclosure," he said. "Public record, statements under oath." It would mean dragging the truth into the open. I thought of the hallway wall with the missing photo, the coat rack without a space for me, the wedding album where I appeared like a mistake. I thought of how carefully they had curated a version of the family that didn't require me. "Yes," I said, "I want to contest it." The silence on the other end was brief but meaningful. "Then you should prepare yourself," he replied, "because once this starts, it won't stay quiet." That night my phone rang. It was my sister. Her name lit up the screen like a warning. I let it ring. Then it rang again. And again. I didn't answer. Because for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't mine to carry. The calls didn't stop after that night. Emily tried again the next morning. Then my mother. Then my father for the first time in years. 3 missed calls. 2 voicemails. All within 48 hours of the attorney confirming I was contesting the amendments. The timing wasn't subtle. I listened to the voicemails in order. My mother's voice came first, soft, strained, careful. "Sweetheart, we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. The word felt rehearsed, like something practiced in front of a mirror. My father's message was shorter, tighter. "You need to call us back. This is getting out of hand." Out of hand. As if I had reached into something that didn't belong to me. As if my existence was the disruption. Emily's voicemail was last. She sounded different than I remembered, less composed, more urgent. "You don't know the full story," she said. "Please don't do this way." I deleted none of them. I saved every message, every timestamp. The attorney had warned me, once legal processes begin, even emotion becomes evidence. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on what the lawyer asked me to prepare. A timeline. My version of events. Proof of contact attempts. Proof of silence. Proof that I had never chosen estrangement as the trust amendments claimed. That phrase bothered me more than anything else. Chosen estrangement. It sounded clean, voluntary, mutual. It erased responsibility. So I started pulling records. Emails I had sent that were never answered. Phone logs showing unanswered calls. Holiday messages marked seen but ignored. Screenshots of invitations I never received. Announcements I learned about secondhand. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged, one that contradicted everything my parents had submitted under oath. The attorney scheduled a preliminary meeting with the opposing counsel. I wasn't required to attend, but I asked to listen in. I wanted to hear how they explained me. What I heard was surreal. They described me as distant, unresponsive, disengaged from family life. They implied concern, claimed they had respected my boundaries I had never set. When my attorney pushed back, asked for dates, proof-documented outreach, the tone shifted. Hesitation crept in. Answers became vague. "We don't have everything in front of us," the other lawyer said. "This was years ago. Years ago. That was the point." After the call, my attorney was quiet for a moment. "They assumed you wouldn't challenge this," he said finally. "Or that you couldn't." That sentence stayed with me. They hadn't just erased me because they wanted to. They erased me because they believed they could. The next escalation came quickly. A certified letter arrived from my parents' attorney requesting mediation. The language was formal, but the message was clear: they wanted this contained. Quiet. Resolved without hearings. They wanted to fix it without admitting anything. I declined. That decision triggered something I hadn't expected. Retaliation. My health insurance provider called to confirm a recent update to my emergency contact information submitted by a third party claiming legal authority. I froze. "That's not possible," I said. "No one has authority to change that." The representative paused. "We'll flag it for review," she said carefully. That afternoon, my bank contacted me about an inquiry into old joint accounts I had closed years ago. Someone had requested transaction histories tied to my name. Someone was scrambling. My attorney moved fast. Cease and desist letters went out. Notifications were filed. A formal record was created, documenting attempted interference. That was when the tone from my family changed. The next voicemail from my mother was no longer gentle. "Why are you doing this to us?" she asked, voice tight. "After everything we've done for you." There it was. Not "what did we do to you," but "why are you making this difficult?" Emily sent a text that night. "This doesn't have to go public. You're hurting people." I stared at the message for a long time before replying with one sentence. "I didn't start this." She didn't respond. A week later, the attorney called me into his office. Not for a call, not for an update, in person. He slid a document across the desk, a copy of the amended trust marked with notes and highlights. He pointed to a section near the bottom. "This clause," he said, "was added after your grandparents passed. It allowed for removal of beneficiaries under extraordinary relational breakdown. It required documentation that didn't exist. They created justification after the fact," he continued. "And they assumed no one would ever compare it to the original." My throat tightened. "They didn't just erase you from memory," he said. "They tried to erase you from inheritance law." That was the moment the story shifted for me. This wasn't about money. I hadn't even known the trust existed. This was about something more fundamental, the belief that I was expendable, that my absence could be explained away with enough paperwork. The attorney informed me that a formal hearing was likely. A judge would review the amendments, statements would be taken under oath, the process would be public record. I asked the question that had been sitting heavy in my chest. "Will they have to explain why?" "Yes," he said. "In detail." That night, I finally returned one call. My father answered on the first ring. "What do you want?" he asked, skipping any pretense. "I want the truth," I said. "Why was I removed?" Silence. Then we did what we thought was best. "For who?" I asked. "For the family," he replied. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the most honest thing he'd said in years. "You decided I wasn't part of it," I said quietly. "You left," he snapped. "No," I corrected him. "You erased me." He hung up. I didn't feel relief after that call. I felt confirmation. Whatever version of events they had built over the years, it couldn't survive scrutiny. And they knew it. The next notice from the court arrived 2 weeks later. A date, a location, a requirement for appearance. For the first time since my name started disappearing from walls and albums and stories, It would be spoken aloud in a public room attached to documents that couldn't be edited or cropped. I wasn't anxious. I was ready. The weeks leading up to the hearing moved differently than time had before. Every day felt deliberate, measured, like each hour carried weight. I stopped counting time by work deadlines or weekends and started counting it by documents, received calls, logged emails, forwarded to my attorney. My life had narrowed to facts, and strangely that made things clearer. The legal letter had cracked something open, not just in the case, but in me. For the first time, my family's silence had a structure I could point to. Dates, signatures, clauses, evidence that didn't care how emotional anyone felt. That scared them. It didn't scare me anymore. My attorney warned me that before the hearing there would be attempts to humanize the situation. That was the word he used. Not apologize, not explain, humanize. Which meant someone would try to make me feel responsible for their discomfort. He was right. My mother showed up unannounced one afternoon. I saw her car from my apartment window before I heard the knock. Same sedan, same careful parking job aligned perfectly between the lines, as if precision could soften what she was about to do. I didn't open the door right away. I watched her through the peephole, how she smoothed her coat, how she glanced down the hallway like she was checking for witnesses. She knocked again, softer this time. When I opened the door, she smiled like we were resuming a conversation paused only minutes ago. "There you are," she said. I was worried. I stepped aside and let her in, not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to hear what she would say when she couldn't hang up or redirect the conversation. She sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, eyes scanning the room, noticing the absence of family photos, the clean counters, the life that didn't include her. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said finally. "We could have talked." I leaned against the counter and waited. "You've always been so independent," she continued. "You didn't need us like the others did." There it was again. The justification wrapped in compliment. "You removed my name from legal documents," I said calmly. "That's not independence. That's erasure." Her smile flickered. "You're exaggerating." I reached into a folder on the table and slid a copy of the trust amendment toward her. She didn't touch it. "That document required intent," I said. "You signed it." Her voice hardened. "We did what we thought was necessary." "Necessary for what?" She hesitated. "Just long enough. For stability," she said. "For clarity." "Clarity." I nodded slowly. "And where did I fit into that clarity?" She looked down at her hands. "You didn't." The honesty of it stunned me more than any denial could have. She left shortly after. No apology, no acknowledgement of harm, just a quiet statement before she walked out. "This will destroy what's left of the family." I didn't respond, because what was left had already been built without me. After that visit, communication stopped entirely. No more calls, no more messages, no more attempts to explain or negotiate. The next correspondence came through attorneys only. That's when I knew we had crossed into the phase where feelings no longer mattered, only outcomes did. The pre-hearing disclosures arrived in a thick packet. I sat on the floor and went through them page by page. Statements from my parents, a sworn affidavit from Emily, supplemental explanations drafted by their legal counsel. They told a consistent story. I was distant. I had chosen my own path. They respected my space. The amendments reflected reality. What they couldn't explain, what they avoided entirely, was why my name appeared in early drafts at all. Why documentation of estrangement only surfaced after assets were distributed. Why no attempt had ever been made to notify me. Their story was smooth. The timeline wasn't. My attorney highlighted that gap in red. "This is where it breaks," he said. "They needed you gone before distribution, not after." That sentence lingered with me. They didn't remove me because I left. They removed me so they could proceed without me. As the hearing approached, I was asked if I wanted to make a statement, not in court, that would come later, but for the record. A written account to be entered into the file. I spent 2 nights writing it. Not dramatic, not emotional, just precise. Dates, interactions, silence. I didn't accuse. I described. And when I finished, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger requires hope. It requires the belief that someone might change if confronted hard enough. I had moved past that. The day before the hearing, I received one last message. Not from my parents, from Emily. It was a single paragraph. "We didn't think this would ever come back. We thought it was settled. Please reconsider. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just fear. I didn't reply. The hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning at the county courthouse. Public building, open docket, no private rooms, no quiet resolution, exactly what they had tried to avoid. I arrived early, dressed simply, not for sympathy, not for effect, just presentable, real. In the waiting area, I saw them for the first time in years. My parents sat together stiff, avoiding eye contact. Emily sat a few chairs away, scrolling through her phone like it could protect her. No one approached me. No one waved. No one smiled. When my name was called, it echoed through the room, clear, unambiguous, recorded. I stood. For years, my family had spoken about me as if I didn't exist. Now the court required them to explain why I did. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, not imposing, not dramatic, just rows of benches, muted walls, and the quiet hum of procedure. It wasn't designed to intimidate, it was designed to record. That mattered, because everything said in that room would exist long after feelings faded. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The ritual felt automatic, practiced. I wondered how many times my parents had stood in rooms like this before signing papers, authorizing changes, making decisions that assumed I would never be present to object. They stood now because they had no choice. The judge began with a summary. Names, dates, the nature of the dispute. Each word was neutral, stripped of emotion. When my name was read clearly, correctly, I felt something settle inside me. Not pride, not relief, recognition. My attorney spoke first. He didn't dramatize. He laid out the timeline with precision. Original trust documents, beneficiary lists, amendments, the absence of notice, the lack of documented estrangement prior to distribution. He didn't ask the judge to feel sorry for me. He asked the court to notice inconsistencies. Then it was their turn. Their attorney stood and painted a picture of a family respecting boundaries. He spoke of emotional distance, of a child who chose independence early, of parents who believed they were honoring that choice. The words sounded reasonable until the judge asked for evidence. "Where are the records of attempted contact?" she asked calmly. A pause. "Where are the notices sent to the removed beneficiary?" Another pause. "And where is the documentation supporting extraordinary relational breakdown?" This time the silence stretched. Their attorney deflected, citing verbal understandings, family dynamics, private matters. He suggested that not everything leaves a paper trail. The judge nodded once, then looked down at the file in front of her. "But trust amendments do," she said. Emily was called to testify. She walked to the stand with careful steps, posture straight, expression controlled. This was familiar territory for her, presenting, well, speaking, confidently, choosing words that suggested competence. She explained that I had pulled away over the years, that I didn't attend events, that I didn't return calls, that it felt natural eventually to stop including me. "Did you inform your sibling they were being removed as a beneficiary?" the judge asked. Emily hesitated. "We didn't think it was necessary." "Why not?" "Because we believed they wouldn't want involvement." The judge's pen stopped moving. "Based on what she asked," Emily's voice faltered. "Based on behavior." "Specific behavior," the judge clarified. Emily glanced toward my parents, then back to the bench. "I can't give exact dates," she admitted. The judge nodded again. "Thank you." My mother testified next. She spoke softly, emotionally. She described years of worry, of not knowing how to reach me, of respecting space, of doing what she thought was best for the family's stability. When asked why she signed documents removing me, she answered without hesitation. "We believed it reflected reality." The judge leaned back slightly. "Reality," she repeated. "Or convenience," the question hung in the air. My father was last. He didn't soften his tone. He spoke plainly, defensively. He insisted I had chosen my own life and therefore relinquished involvement. "When someone walks away," he said, "you eventually stop chasing them." The judge looked at him steadily. "And when someone walks away," she replied, "do you remove them from legal instruments without notification?" He didn't answer. Then it was my turn. I wasn't required to speak. My attorney had made that clear. The record already favored me. But I asked to, not to argue, to state facts. I took the stand and told the truth simply. About unanswered calls, about missing invitations, about discovering I had been removed from documents I didn't know existed. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't speculate about motives. I described what happened. When I finished, the judge thanked me and asked one final question. Did you ever tell your family you wanted to be removed? No, I said. Did you ever refuse contact? No. Did you ever waive your rights? No. That was it. The judge closed the file. I'm going to take a brief recess, she said. When we return, I will issue findings. We stood again as she left. In the hallway, no one spoke to me. My parents huddled with their attorney. Emily stared at the floor. I sat alone on a bench and waited. For the first time in years, waiting didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like process. When we were called back and the judge didn't waste time, she ruled that the amendments removing me were invalid due to lack of notice, insufficient documentation, and misrepresentation of relational status. She ordered the trust to be reevaluated with my inclusion restored retroactively. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. She addressed my parents directly. The court finds that the beneficiary was not estranged by choice, she said, but was excluded by action. The words were recorded, transcribed, permanent. My parents didn't react outwardly. Emily closed her eyes. The judge continued. This court does not rule on family relationships, but it does require honesty in legal declarations. In this case, honesty was absent. Gavel. Adjourned. It was over. Not emotionally, not relationally, but legally. Outside the courthouse, reporters weren't waiting. There were no spectators. Just a few people passing by, unaware that something significant had just ended. My attorney shook my hand. You did well, he said. I nodded. My parents walked past me without stopping. Emily hesitated, then followed them. No one apologized. No one explained. They didn't need to anymore, because the truth had already been entered into the record. For years, my family had erased me quietly, carefully believing silence would protect them. They were wrong. Silence doesn't disappear in court. It gets translated, and once translated into fact, it can't be edited out. The ruling didn't end things the way I once imagined justice would. There was no dramatic confrontation in the courthouse hallway. No tearful confession. No sudden understanding. The decision simply existed, solid, documented, irreversible, and for my family that was worse. In the days that followed, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence I had lived with for years. This one was reactive, tight, pressurized, the kind that comes after something has been exposed and can't be undone. My attorney warned me about this phase. Now that the record exists, he said, people tend to protect themselves. Protect meant minimize, reframe, rewrite again. Within a week, I began hearing versions of the story through indirect channels. A cousin messaged me, awkward and hesitant. I heard there was a misunderstanding with some paperwork. A misunderstanding. An old family friend called and asked gently if everything was settled now, as if the issue had been a minor accounting error. I realized then that the erasure hadn't just been about me. It had been about controlling the narrative everyone else consumed. And now that the legal system had challenged that narrative, my family was trying to rebuild it without admitting fault. They couldn't erase the court record, but they could try to shrink it. The trust reevaluation process moved forward methodically. Financial statements were reviewed, distribution schedules recalculated. Numbers that had once excluded me now had to account for my presence. I watched it happen from a distance, receiving updates through my attorney. I didn't celebrate. I didn't plan what I would do with money I had never expected. That wasn't the point. What mattered was the acknowledgement that something had been taken without consent, and that it had been returned not because of generosity, but because of obligation. During that process, another detail surfaced, one that shifted the ground beneath everything. The attorney called me late one afternoon, his tone more serious than usual. There's something else, he said. It wasn't just the trust. He explained that while reviewing the documentation trail, they had uncovered additional filings, educational records, dependent declarations, insurance forms, that had been altered over the years using similar justifications. Someone established a pattern, he said, and the trust was only the most valuable piece. The phrase pattern made my chest tighten. This wasn't an isolated decision made in a moment of frustration. It was a strategy. My parents had gradually redefined my existence on paper, reducing my legal footprint wherever possible. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to make me easier to exclude when it mattered. Why would they do that? I asked. My attorney paused. Control and risk management. Risk, as if I were a liability, as if my presence complicated something they wanted simplified. That explanation hurt more than anger ever could. because it meant the erasure wasn't emotional. It was calculated. The court required additional disclosures, not hearings, reviews, compliance checks, quiet but thorough. And with each review, the truth became harder to deny. My parents didn't contact me during this time. Not once. Emily sent one final message, short and detached. This didn't have to be this way. I stared at it for a long time before replying. It already was. That was the last exchange we had. As the weeks passed, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my body. Space. Not the hollow kind I had lived with for years, but something cleaner. Like a room that had been emptied of furniture you never liked but were afraid to move. I realized I was no longer waiting for anything from them. No explanation, no apology, no recognition. The court had done what my family wouldn't. It named what happened, and that freed me from needing them to agree. The trust distributions were finalized quietly. Funds transferred, accounts updated, my name restored where it had been removed. When the confirmation arrived, I read it once, then filed it away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. A few days later, I ran into my father unexpectedly at a grocery store near my apartment. He was older than I remembered. Smaller, less certain. We stood a few feet apart, surrounded by fluorescent lights and shelves of cereal. He looked at me like he wanted to say something. I waited. "You didn't have to involve the court," he said finally. I met his eyes. "You didn't have to erase me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to argue. He walked away without another word. That interaction confirmed something important. Even now, even after everything, he didn't see what he'd done as wrong, just inconvenient. And that was all the closure I needed. The final stage of the process came not with a gavel, but with a letter, this one addressed correctly, formally, undeniably to me. It summarized the court's findings, the corrective actions taken, and the conclusion of the matter. At the bottom in small print was a line that mattered more than any dollar amount. The record now reflects accurate beneficiary history. Accurate, not generous, not kind. Accurate. For years, my existence had been negotiable in my own family's eyes. Something they could adjust, crop, or remove when it suited them. The legal system didn't care about their comfort. It cared about truth. And truth, once documented, doesn't need permission to exist. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a place far more ordinary and far more public. About a month after the trust corrections were finalized, my attorney informed me that a mandatory compliance meeting had been scheduled. Not a hearing, not a trial. A formal review session required by the court to ensure that all corrective actions had been implemented properly. Attendance wasn't optional. It would include legal counsel, a court-appointed compliance officer, and all primary parties involved in the original amendments, which meant my parents would be there. Emily, too. The meeting was held in a municipal conference room downtown. Glass walls, neutral carpet, fluorescent lights that didn't flatter anyone. The kind of place where emotion feels out of place, where words carry weight, simply because they're recorded. When I arrived, they were already seated. My parents sat side by side, stiff and silent. Emily sat across from them, flipping through a folder she didn't seem to be reading. No one looked up when I entered. I took my seat without acknowledging them. The compliance officer began by reviewing the court's findings. She spoke clearly, precisely, reading directly from the record. Dates, violations, required corrections. Each sentence felt like a confirmation of something I had lived through but was never allowed to name. Then came the documentation review. The officer asked my parents to explain the discrepancies identified across multiple records, not just the trust, but insurance forms, dependent declarations, and educational filings. "This review is not punitive," she said calmly. "It is corrective, but accuracy is required." My mother spoke first. She tried to frame it as confusion, as administrative oversight, as paperwork handled during stressful times. The officer listened, then asked for supporting documentation. There was none. My father grew defensive. "We were managing family matters," he said. "We did what we thought was appropriate." The compliance officer looked up. Appropriate for whom he didn't answer. Emily was asked next. She explained her role in coordinating updates, admitted she had helped gather documents, but insisted she acted on her parents' instructions. "Did you ever question the removal of your sibling?" the officer asked. Emily hesitated, then said no. That single word echoed louder than any argument could have. The officer turned to me. "Do you have anything to add to the record?" she asked. I hadn't planned to speak. My attorney had advised against it unless necessary. The facts were already established. But something about the room, the glass walls, the presence of strangers, the weight of accountability made silence feel different. "Yes," I said. Everyone looked at me then. "I want the record to reflect that I was never informed," I said calmly. "I never consented. And I never chose estrangement." The officer nodded and made a note. My parents shifted in their seats. The officer continued. "Based on this review," she said, "the court finds a pattern of misrepresentation across multiple administrative actions. While corrective measures have been implemented, this record will remain on file. Remain. Permanent. There would be no rewriting this later. No cropping. No quiet removal." The meeting concluded without drama. No raised voices. No emotional appeals. Just signatures and acknowledgements. As people began to stand, my mother finally looked at me. Her expression wasn't angry. It was unsettled. "We never meant for it to go this far," she said softly. I met her gaze. "It went exactly as far as it needed to," I replied. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Outside the building, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. People walked by. No one knew what had just been finalized inside those glass walls. And that was fine. Justice doesn't require an audience. It requires a record. As I walked away, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the burden of proving I existed. That burden had shifted back to where it belonged. A few days later, a final document arrived from the court. Not addressed to my attorney. Addressed directly to me. It confirmed the completion of compliance. It summarized the findings. And it included a line that I read several times before fully absorbing. "The court acknowledges the restoration of full legal standing." Restoration. That word mattered. Not because something new had been given to me, but because something taken without consent had been returned with acknowledgement. I printed the document and placed it in a folder with the rest of my records. Not as a trophy, as a reference. Proof that silence doesn't mean absence. That erasure isn't permanent when truth is documented. That standing quietly doesn't mean standing weakly. I didn't hear from my family after that. No calls, no messages, no attempts to reconnect. And I didn't chase them. For years, I believed that being included required permission. I was wrong. Inclusion, I learned, isn't something others grant. It's something the truth enforces. After the compliance meeting, life didn't return to normal. It became something else entirely. For years, my sense of stability had been built on adaptation, on learning how to exist without acknowledgement, how to remain quiet without disappearing completely. When that weight was lifted, I discovered something unsettling. I didn't know who I was without it. The days after the court's final confirmation felt oddly empty. There were no more emails to forward, no documents to review, no deadlines tied to defending my own existence. The process that had consumed so much emotional energy had ended, and in its place was space I hadn't prepared for. I went back to work. Colleagues asked how things were going. I told them everything was resolved. That was true, but incomplete. Resolution on paper doesn't immediately translate to peace in the body. At night, I still replayed moments from the past, not with the same confusion or self-doubt, but with clarity that came too late to change them. I saw how early the pattern had begun. How often I had been subtly guided away from visibility. How often silence had been mistaken for consent. The difference now was that I no longer wondered whether I had imagined it. The court record had validated something deeply personal. I hadn't been sensitive. I hadn't been dramatic. I hadn't misunderstood. I had been excluded deliberately. That understanding brought grief. Not the loud kind. The quiet, delayed kind that arrives after danger has passed. I grieved the version of my family I thought I had. The future I assumed would include reconciliation. The hope that if I just stayed patient enough, things would eventually correct themselves. They hadn't. They had only escalated. One afternoon, I received a message from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. It was cautious, formal. I heard about the legal situation. I didn't realize things were that serious. I read it twice. Didn't realize. That was the phrase people used when they didn't want to admit they hadn't asked. I replied simply, "They were." She didn't respond. That became the pattern. Distant relatives reached out briefly, awkwardly. None apologized. None asked how I was. They just wanted reassurance that the situation was handled. Handled meant over. Handled meant they didn't have to examine their own silence. I stopped expecting more. The trust funds were transferred quietly into an account I barely looked at. I hired a financial advisor not because I wanted to grow the money, but because I wanted distance from it. The money wasn't victory. It was evidence. And evidence belongs in files, not emotions. What mattered more was what I noticed changing inside me. I stopped explaining myself. When people interrupted me, I finished my sentence anyway. When decisions were being made around me, I spoke up, not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly. I didn't feel the need to justify my presence anymore. That shift surprised even me. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes, I found a small photo album I had taken with me years ago when I moved out. It held duplicates, pictures my parents hadn't wanted to keep or had forgotten to remove. There I was, at birthdays, at graduations, standing between people who later claimed I wasn't really there. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages slowly. The photos hadn't changed. I had. I realized then that erasure only works when the person being erased cooperates, when they internalize the message that they don't matter enough to insist on being seen. I had stopped cooperating. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought something steadier. Ownership. A few weeks later, my attorney called one last time. "There's nothing else pending," he said. "This chapter is closed." I thanked him and hung up. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I blocked my parents' numbers. Not out of spite, out of clarity. If they ever wanted to speak to me, they could find a way that didn't involve denial or control. Until then, I wasn't available to be minimized. The absence that followed felt different from the ones before. This time I chose it. I began to rebuild my life around things that didn't require family approval. I traveled. I took a class I'd always postponed. I made decisions without checking how they would be perceived. Slowly, carefully, I learned how to stand without bracing for disappearance. One morning, while walking to work, I caught my reflection in a store window and stopped. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. I looked like someone who knew where they stood. For years, my family had tried to erase me quietly, assuming silence would protect them from consequence. They were wrong. Silence doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And when it finally reaches the surface through documents, through testimony, through undeniable proof, it speaks louder than anything said aloud. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I stayed present long enough for the truth to catch up. The last thing to settle wasn't legal. It was internal. After everything ended, after the documents were corrected, the records finalized, the silence reclaimed on my terms, I expected relief to arrive fully formed, like a door closing, like a weight dropping. Instead, it came in fragments. It came when I realized I no longer checked my phone, hoping or fearing it would be them. It came when holidays passed and I didn't feel the familiar ache of exclusion. It came when I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. What surprised me most was how quiet that peace was. No announcement, no moment of triumph, just a steady absence of tension. For the first time in my life, my sense of worth wasn't tied to whether my family acknowledged me. That acknowledgement had finally arrived, but from a place that didn't require love or approval. It came from the truth. I thought often about how easily I had accepted being minimized, how long I had mistaken silence for maturity, how often I had told myself that enduring quietly was the same as being strong. It isn't. Endurance without truth is just slow disappearance. What saved me wasn't confrontation. I didn't argue my way back into existence. I didn't demand apologies or force emotional reckoning. I stayed still long enough for the facts to surface, and when they did, I let them speak. People sometimes ask if I regret taking it that far, if I wish I had handled it within the family. I don't. Because what I learned is this: when someone benefits from your silence, they will always call your voice unnecessary. My family never expected consequences because they never expected resistance. They believed I would continue shrinking, continue adapting, continue doubting myself. They were wrong. Not because I became louder, but because I stopped disappearing. I no longer tell the story to explain myself. I tell it because there are people living inside similar silence, wondering if they're imagining things, wondering if being erased is somehow their fault. It isn't. Sometimes exclusion doesn't come with cruelty. It comes with paperwork, with polite distance, with decisions made for stability. And sometimes the only justice available isn't emotional, it's factual. The law didn't give me a family. It gave me something else. It gave me standing. Standing to say I was here. I am here. And I was never optional. I don't know what my parents tell themselves now. I don't know how they justify what they did when they look back. That's no longer my concern. What matters is that the version of me they tried to erase no longer needs their memory to exist. I built a life that doesn't require revision, a life where my presence isn't debated, edited, or quietly removed. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about winning or proving anyone wrong. It's this: silence can protect others, but it costs you. Truth may arrive late, but when it does, it stands. If you've ever felt yourself being slowly written out of your own story, I hope this reminds you of something important. You don't need permission to exist, and you don't need volume to be heard. Sometimes all it takes is staying long enough for the truth to catch up. If this story made you reflect on your own experiences, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet endurance, late justice, and finding your footing after being underestimated, consider subscribing. Because even when you're erased for years, the truth remembers you. There is a quiet lesson hidden inside stories like this one that isn't about winning revenge or even justice in the dramatic sense. It's about self-recognition. In real life, not everyone who hurts you will raise their voice. Some people erase you gently. They smile. They stay polite. They tell themselves they're doing what's best. And if you're someone who was taught to be understanding, patient, and silent, you may spend years believing the absence is your fault. You may think that if you just endure long enough, things will correct themselves. But silence doesn't heal what truth is meant to confront. The hardest moment isn't when you realize you were wronged. It's when you realize how long you accepted it because you didn't think you were allowed to ask for more. This story isn't about becoming loud. It's about becoming solid. About standing still long enough to see clearly and trusting that clarity even when others deny it. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need approval to exist. And you don't need to be chosen by people who benefit from ignoring you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop disappearing. If this story made you reflect on moments in your own life, times you felt overlooked, minimized, or quietly pushed aside, I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. You're not alone even if it once felt that way. And if stories about quiet strength, late justice, and emotional healing resonate with you, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories are coming. Stories that remind us that even when the truth arrives late, it still arrives strong.